Many stars have an extended atmosphere that reaches out beyond the planets into their interplanetary space. This atmosphere is made of charged particles that continuously flow outwards in a spiral. This is the solar wind that travels towards the Earth, where it runs into the atmosphere, our atmosphere. As the protons and electrons from the solar wind hit the particles in the Earth's atmosphere, they release energy and creates aspects of space weather conditions. Understanding the structures that make up the solar wind, such as in the magnetic field, velocity, temperature, and density, is essential to understanding and predicting the behavior that impacts us here on Earth. In this challenge, we invited the team to use the machine learning to detect solar wind structures, comparing measurements close to the sun from the new Parker Solar Probe mission, as well as other missions far from the sun. This allows us to study how patterns in the solar wind develop as they propagate further out into space as they leave the sun. We are also proud that this team is hosting 2 undergraduate students as research interns. This is part of a larger effort to extend Frontier Development Lab's reach and support researchers from currently underrepresented groups in physics and machine learning research. I'm delighted to introduce this team's work here today, uncovering the origin of solar wind.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with us through all of these amazing presentations and discussions. On behalf of the Solar Wind Evolution team, we're all very excited to share with you what we've been up to this summer. My name's Amanda Camarada, and I am joined by our amazing researchers, Sudeshna, Nathan, Mavis, Hala, and Marcella. But we also want to give special thanks to our mentors, Anna, Andres, Cyram, Adam, and Anthony, for all of their knowledge and support this summer. So let's begin with what the solar wind is. The solar wind is a constant ejection of charged particles expelled radially from the sun's corona. On this top-down view of our solar system, you can see that as the sun rotates, the solar wind creates this ballerina skirt effect that extends outward into space. The different colors denote different densities, with the lighter colors corresponding to higher densities. So you'll see that the solar wind does not travel outward in a uniform structure. Now, our Earth exists in a constant bombardment of the solar wind. And while we are largely protected from the solar wind by our magnetosphere, the solar wind can affect the technology in space that directly impacts our way of life, such as communications, GPS, and long-duration missions in space. Sudeshna will tell us more about why the solar wind is important.
Thanks, Amanda. So, the solar wind is one of the key drivers of planetary atmospheric loss. So what we see on the left here on the illustration is the bombardment of solar wind particles on Earth. But because we have a global magnetic field, a majority of these particles get deflected. But if you're Mars, you're not that lucky. Because Mars doesn't have a global magnetic field, the solar wind can strip away a large chunk of the planet's atmosphere. So this brings us to the point that if we want to have a good understanding of how a habitable atmosphere develops and survives around the planet or even exoplanet, we need to know about the solar wind, its origin and its evolution through space. That's why this summer at FDL, our team investigated the different structures embedded in the solar wind and as it propagates throughout the space. So that's why Nathan is going to talk to us about the different structures and what we did today, this summer.
Thanks, Sudeshna. So embedded in the solar wind is the interplanetary magnetic field. And now, just like how the wind blows past you on a breezy day here on Earth, the interplanetary magnetic field blows past our instruments in space as it is carried outward by the solar wind. In measuring the magnetic field, we can observe structures like we see here on the left. This structure is known as an interplanetary coronal mass ejection, and they occur at a rate of about 10 to 50 times per year, depending on solar activity. As the largest structures embedded in the solar wind, they are easily identifiable in instruments. And they were discovered relatively early on in our journey to understand the solar wind. Next, we have interplanetary magnetic field enhancements, which occur at a rate of about 10 to 20 times per year, but they span significantly shorter durations of time, on the timescales of about an hour or two. And they're much smaller in amplitude, leading to a delay in their discovery until the 1980s. Now, if we go even smaller, we have switchbacks, which have extremely high occurrence rates of order 5,000 per year. Now, interestingly enough, these objects went undetected in the slow solar wind until 2019 because they exist in a region of space that was previously unexplored until the launch of the Parker Solar Probe in 2018. So this begs the question, what other structures are out there that have yet to be identified? And how do we look for them in the vast amount of data that we have available? So just how much data is there? Well, there's a lot. And here we are showing 205 5-minute intervals that add up to just 17 hours worth of observations. And you can already see how overwhelming it would be for a single person to sort and catalog these structures. And that 17 hours, well, that's just 0.1% of our full data set containing nearly 15 hours worth of observations. But this isn't just overwhelming for a person, it's also overwhelming for a computer. Traditional approaches require pointwise comparisons between two different time series, which is computationally expensive, requiring over 90 trillion operations. And this is largely infeasible for our accelerated 8-week timeline. So instead, we used a non-traditional approach, to be explained by Mavis, that significantly reduces the number of computations by a factor of 30 million in order to sort and understand our structures in the solar wind.
Thanks for the rundown, Nathan. Now let's take a look at how this non-traditional approach works. On the left, we have a collection of time series data that we want to sort. First, we divide our time series data into different levels. So here you can see that we have level 0 and 1. Next, we split our time series data into smaller segments and assign each segment a letter. And then finally, last but not least, we represent the data set as a word. All these data sets are very similar and hence have the same word sequence, A, B. Our machine learning approach goes through every magnetic curve in our data set and represents it as a word sequence. If there are magnetic curves that have the same word sequence, then our method will group them together into a single batch. As a result, we can group together all similar patterns without doing any tedious calculations, as Nathan had mentioned. Once the machine learning algorithm is finished, we can look through all the results to see whether there are any new structures that occur frequently enough to be considered important patterns. Marcella will be showing this next.
So now that we have our data, which are time series with 5 hours interval each, we sort them and split into 5-minute time segments and convert them into the word sequences that Mavis just said about. After that, we embed it into our pipeline to be clustered according to their patterns. This figures shows all the patterns inside a 6-hour interval at the left. Each color represents a different pattern. On the right side, we highlighted the 4 most frequent patterns from the specific example of September. We see that the data has the same color are grouped by similarity. It's important to note that now we can encode 90,000 segments using only 300 patterns. There is a reduction for human scientists by a factor of 300 times less patterns to analyze. Besides, in our pipeline, we can play with scales, applying different time chunk segments besides the 5 minutes, which can bring us different results. In the next slide, Hala will emphasize why our pipeline is a powerful tool for we scientists.
Thank you, Marcella. After our 8-week program, we are now able to identify distinctive features and group similar time series into recognizable patterns. Our findings revealed multiple clusters of solar magnetic structures like switchbacks, and most importantly, unique signatures which have been unclassified and understudied to this day. This paved the way for the comprehensive annotation of solar wind data, enabling the application of powerful machine learning techniques. Here, you see 1% of the 90,000 segments that we have so far sorted and grouped into 300 clusters. In this example, we have 8 clusters from the 300. Now, instead of having to stare at 90,000 segments, together with heliophysicists, we can interact with the reduced number of patterns to better understand the structure, evolution, and origin of the solar wind with an unprecedented level of detail. We thank the FDL, NASA, City Institute, Google Cloud for providing us with compute resourcing, our Intel mentors for their precious guidance, and all the generous partners without whom this work would not have been possible. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Solar Wind team. That was very well done. And we'll go ahead and bring up our panel with Bill. And I just wanted to say, I think that it's amazing, these panels. We've gotten everything from analogies of solar tides to a book reading list from Scott. So I can't wait to hear what this last panel is going to say.
Absolutely true. Well, it's excellent. And I do want to say before we get into the panel, don't go away after the panel concludes our remarks, because we have more to come here, including some award presentations for the teams and their work this year. And we're going to hear also from the leadership at NASA Ames Research Center, who's been a partner in the FDL program from the beginning. So please stay on with us as we continue the program. And with that, let me introduce another panelist joining me and Scott for this discussion on the solar wind, and that is Sairam Sundarasan, who's a deep learning research engineer at Intel. So hello, Sairam.
Hi, Bill. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here.
So you're working on deep learning techniques at Intel. From your point of view, what's the breakthrough work done by the team here in their approach to this problem set?
First of all, I want to congratulate the team for the immense amount of hard work they've put in over the summer. I know how much they have worked really hard, and the results speak for themselves. From sort of the machine learning side, I think this project highlights one of the most important perspectives or the important components of machine learning, which is the data, because clearly this problem is a limited labeled data set, if you want to call it that. So you have almost decades worth of data and you don't have somebody to label it all for you, which makes it a very challenging problem from the machine learning side. So the fact that they were able to identify a structured method to holistically approach it, identify patterns, basically feed the data to the machine learning pipeline, allow it to find patterns itself versus sort of forcing human bias into the picture, allowing it to find structure, and then using those structures to work with scientists to sort of identify meaning. I think that's a sort of a funnel approach that really allows you to conduct research. And secondly, I think it allows others to stand upon the shoulders of sort of the folks who have built this pipeline to further the research forward. So from that perspective, I think it's very novel.
So that's a really interesting point, Sarah, because it seems like we often think of these AI and machine learning tools as these things we can take out of the toolbox and simply apply to a problem. But in this case, for example, the team had to do a lot of work with the data. I believe it was the team, as opposed to an algorithm, that went ahead and decided to structure the data sets into these quadrants that therefore allowed or facilitated the algorithm to function. Am I understanding that correctly, Scott? And is what's your sense on this notion of data preparation and or methodology and approach to ensure the success of an AI ML approach?
Yeah, I think Saram sort of nailed it. It's like a lot of times solving the problem is all about framing it correctly.
Yeah.
And I think and this is just a genius, guys. I see time series all the time, and what's really fascinating to me, Saram, is that as they get into this, you can look at a time series, and by human ingenuity and saying, you know what, we're going to do a 2D bandpass filter, and we're going to label the segments and then turn it into a grammar, much like you do nucleotides in DNA. And then can we analyze that as a pattern? That is just so flipping cool. But then the next thing is, I'm curious about that. Can you use sort of like semi-supervised learning to learn to learn that 2D segmentation. That'd be pretty cool. Then also, could these techniques be used in these other things like next generation sequencing, where now we can actually read the source code to life, but that basically turns nucleotides into speech waves, right? So I think you're really into something here in terms of your ingenious insight, and how does it apply to speech recognition, next generation sequencing, and other complex time series analysis, even Wall Street. So maybe Wall Street's going to call you next. Don't leave, stay in space.
That will fund FDL for the next decade. Let's
yeah, there you go. And so this team of the hedge fund, right? And we're done.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see if we can take that.
Tokenize the whole thing. Yeah.
And I want to, explain for any of the uninitiated. So flippin' cool. That's a technical term.
That's very technical, Bill.
Yeah, very technical. So you can Google that undoubtedly and sort of get a translation. But anyway, thanks, Scott, for those. Sarah, any closing thoughts from your perspective before we jump to the awards?
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Did I hear it wrong?
I heard it wrong. Please go
Sarah
ahead.
and Sarah.
Okay, no, I was just going to say, like Scott said, I think mapping the problem correctly, like there's been immense advances done in machine learning, particularly in language understanding, language processing. So framing a time series problem as sort of this unknown language that the universe is speaking to us, and sort of mapping it into sort of a structure that machine learning can understand, and then categorize as elements of that grammar, and then analyzing that grammar with scientists. I think that's really so flipping cool, so to speak. So
it's like
that's been the consensus
proof,
pretty much across the board. So
but you're right, to the team. Are they getting to the language of the universe? It's a really interesting fundamental question over coffee, right?
Absolutely. So I mean, it's been speaking to us for so many decades, and it's time for us to sort of understand what it's trying to say.
Absolutely. So, Sarah, I think we're going to have to talk to the leadership team at FDL and consider changing the name from FDL to SFC for So Flippin' Cool. But in any way, thank you very much, Sairam and Scott. Thank you for all your insights with every one of these presentations, and again for the incredible and absolutely transformative assistance and support of Google Cloud for the FDL program.